So, George, I wanted to first ask you a little bit about. There's so many things to talk about, I realize, but Heine and his conversion from Judaism. And I was wondering if you could comment a little bit on what led to that conversion in very brief terms, which of course is encapsulated in the Germany of the time, and then move on to his relation to Judaism later on in his life. I know that's a big topic, but if you could
Sure. Well, I
summarize
mean,
that in some way.
one of the things that really struck me when I began researching Heine more intensely than just enjoying his poetry and some of his prose works was the degree to which his life was haunted by what we would today maybe call structural anti-Semitism in terms of on the institutional level. So it wasn't that Heine's personal relationships were especially affected, although he certainly got himself into a few very prickly literary quarrels, which revolved around anti Semitic slurs against him. But when Heine was faced with the necessity of making a living, something that he was never particularly good at, in field after field, he ran into difficulties, which ultimately, in the field that he was to spend the longest pursuing, which was law, proved insurmountable as a Jew. You know, Heine, critically, when he was born, um, Düsseldorf was under French rule, and he grew up it became under French rule almost immediately after his birth. Let me slightly qualify that. And he grew up, as he said, breathing the air of the Gallic spirit, which to him was always the air of freedom, of some kind of egalitarianism, of some sort of tolerance across religions and races. We know now that Napoleon's motivations were sometimes, or maybe primarily in the case of the Jews, opportunistic in terms of him not wanting the Jews to be a people who stood out in rebellion against the French Empire, him wanting Jewish money to fund his various military escapades, etc., his empire building project. But nonetheless, the strictures that Jewish life had been under prior to him were phenomenally intense. I mean, in the generation before, not long before Heine was born, in Frankfurt, Jews couldn't go into public parks. No more than two Jews could walk side by side on the street. There was a curfew at 4 p.m. It was very, very intense. So Heine was thrilled to grow up in what it was at least a much more expansive atmosphere of freedom than much of Germany had enjoyed before Napoleon's ascendancy. This was all taken away after Napoleon's defeat, or mostly taken away. And by the time the Council of Vienna was held in 1813, under the or 1815, sorry, under the rule of this very powerful diplomat Metternich, Prussia acquired rule of Dusseldorf, and this meant a successive and momentum building series of roadblocks were placed in the path of Jews trying to get into education, into law, into any of the white collar professions. Heine resisted conversion for years, even though his family said, you know, you've just got to do this in order to become a practicing lawyer, even though he himself consistently professed religious indifference as a young man. And he would speak about, at one point, he described Judaism as his unlucky genealogical communication. And he had these very vivid images for this mummified people of a language to which he did not feel himself especially associated. But it still rankles that the Prussian state should have the power to impose another religion on him in a purely professional capacity, like joining a club. It bothered him, he resisted and resisted until finally, at some point shortly after he belatedly completed law school, which he took an extremely long time to do, he submitted to religious tutelage, and I think, in fact, tried to find his way simultaneously into discounting the importance of the step and to finding something that he could latch onto as a spiritual plus for him. And that latter, the spiritual side of his conversion, to the extent it existed at all, came down to Luther's translation of the Bible, really. He saw what Luther had done. He has this very fascinating essay that incorporates Luther's translation of the Bible as really bringing the Jews' greatest achievement, the writing of this extraordinary volume of poetry and prose and visionary language, into the Vulgate, into a language that people, that the masses could speak. So he comes at the justification for his conversion via language, as so much of his self-justification always comes down to that. But even at the time it was happening, he was already bucking against it. He knew that this was not going to be a step that would happen quite as easily as he liked to casually toss off the fact that Judaism meant nothing to him, that he was against all essentially monotheistic religions for the repressions that they imposed on the spirit. And he said, as soon as he'd converted, if the law had permitted the stealing of silver spoons, I would never have been baptized. In other words, presenting it as a strictly economical move. And his conversion, in fact, didn't work out. He never got a job on the basis of it. He was haunted by the fact that he'd betrayed, more than the idea of his religion or his people as such, his native identity. He saw this as some profound apostasy of who he was as a person who believed that equality and freedom of thought were just the inheritances of every truly realized individual. He got himself in trouble with the Christians very quickly for writing some things about Luther. Jews who remained loyal to the faith, and this was a time when many, many Jews in Germany were converting, resented and saw him, of course, as a turncoat, as he was. And so he talked about getting up in the middle of the night and staring into the mirror for a solid year after the conversion, wondering what he'd done. In some ways, I came to feel that the conversion was a first step in his greater re-embrace, ironically, of different aspects of his Jewish identity. He begins not that long after converting, reading the Bible intensely and writing in letter after letter and in different works of prose, how moved he is by it, how much he loves the way that the life of ordinary people is uplifted by the sublime language in which it's written about, the way that the most basic stories of our identity as human beings, our universal identity, finds this near perfect language form in what the Bible does. And he starts citing it in new ways. It becomes part of his explicit identity to see himself in the line of biblical prophecy to an extent. He writes about this in relationship to the 1831 revolution in France. He talks as well about himself as he gets older and begins to become more and more unwell. And this is one critical note for those of you who don't know about Heine's life. He may have contracted some form of syphilis when he was young. The illness is not quite clear, but it's suspected to be syphilitic in nature. But he became incredibly debilitated in the last years of his life. The last 7 years of his life, he talks about more or less spending in what he's referred to as his mattress grave. He became almost entirely immobilized and writes a series of poems, really in the voice of a nude Job, about arguing with God about what's happened to him. So I don't know, were those some of the points that you wanted to cover, Michael?
Yeah. I actually wanted to, before we move to the larger discussion, counter that with his Germanness, actually. So in a way, he identifies as a German by being in exile, but he also at the same time is using a lot of what we're told is German folklore, which I know some people in this group are interested in aspects of German folklore in his writing. And I was wondering uh, about that in relation, him as a character of the Romantic movement, when there was this revival in Germany, in Central Europe, of folklore, of fairy tales, of old legends, and so on. And he obviously is using that. He's obviously a figure of the German Romantic period, but in another way, I feel like he isn't. Maybe I am wrong in my summer.
Well, no, I think that's a critical point, is that he doesn't sit easily within, he's born at a point when you're still at the tail end of the Enlightenment, as such as it was in Germany, and Romanticism is also taking off. But he, I always feel, has this third face that really looks towards modernity with the intensity of his self-conscious irony, with this sort of bitter rejection of any definitive passion, with his sense of history and the passions themselves as repetitive forms that humans are compelled by fate, by history, by individual identity to keep re-inhabiting without necessarily, with a greater and greater knowledge, but with less and less ability to act. One of the main ways in which I think that he diverges from traditional Romanticism as such anywhere on the continent is in this, he has an obsession throughout his work with the idea of paralysis, of that we in our time, in this moment, can no longer perform the great deeds of our ancestors. There's no room left on the stage for any sort of dramatic action. Therefore, it all has to happen intellectually. It all has to happen lyrically in language. And it's something that he's never comfortable with and tries, I think, in various ways to um, to evade by reverting in his own life to certain kinds of romantic poses. He fought many duels, for instance. I mean, I think it may be as many as 11. One of them was quite serious. He gets in them over and over, and I'm sure that this was part of his infatuation with tropes of chivalry, with tropes of absolute dedication to a loved one, to principles, etc. But he's simply he's too invested in a grander and very, very cyclical and very, very pessimistic um, image of the way that history, at least as a Jew, plays out, to ever really take that up. There was actually very quickly, I thought, because it relates so well to the issues of autobiography that you referred to at the beginning, the sort of questionable nature. I thought there was one little remark he made that was worth reading to situate the larger discussion, which this is something he said to an interviewer and at a London periodical near the end of his life in 1852, so 4 years before his death. He said, my life has not been one, sorry, excuse me. My life has been one of passion, not of action, of emotion, not of achievement. My autobiography will be pictures of inward moods and dreams, of spiritual joys and sorrows, worship, desperations, angelic peace, gay soarings to the heights that overlook creation. And it's such a marvelous enjambment of the positive and the negative, of the hopefulness that he could never quite quash. And I think, despite what I just said about pessimism, it's Heine, if one is used to reading the Central European Jewish writers of the late 19th century, early 20th, or first half of the 20th century, who are so steeped in a relentless melancholia. Heine has this way of seeing the darkness ahead, of not having any illusions about what's to come, and yet never quite being able or wanting to shed his wild optimism that maybe utopia will happen, that maybe we'll all come together. And that is the revolutionary in him. He never ascribed to very consistently to any particular ideological strand, but he was an absolute believer that justice had to come, and that justice, moreover, would be amplified by happiness. It wasn't a stern paradise that he envisioned at the end of revolution, and he speaks uh, against that dour look at revolution by quoting Shakespeare and say, "Dost thou think because thou art virtuous, there shall be no more cakes and ale?" That was really Heine's revolutionary in a nutshell. He wanted everything for everybody and lots of it.